We're going to go through some of the personality theories out there. It's a pretty important chapter as far as psychology is concerned. Um, we're in the middle of a blizzard, which is really kind of interesting. It looks like a scene from Doctor Zhivago out there. I mean, the wind's blowing about 50 to 60 miles per hour. We've got a snowdrift out there that's about my height, about 5 feet and a half, 5.5 feet tall. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's stacking itself up across the driveway. So we'll see. We'll see if we ever get out. It's only supposed to last for another day, I guess. But we're kind of socked in here. So let's go ahead and get started. Maybe. There we go. Okay. Chapter 11, Personality. Personality refers to the long-standing traits and patterns that propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in specific ways. Our personality is what makes us unique individuals. Each person has an idiosyncratic pattern of enduring long-term characteristics and a manner in which he or she interacts with other individuals in the world around them. Our personalities are thought to be long-term, stable, and not easily changed. The word personality comes from a Latin word, persona. In the ancient world, a persona was a mask worn by an actor. While we tend to think of a mask as being worn to conceal one's identity, the theatrical mask was originally used to either represent or project a specific personality trait of a character, and these are persona. They've all got their mouths open, except that one. And him, and him, and him. The concept of personality has been studied for at least 2,000 years, beginning with Hippocrates in 370 BCE. Hippocrates theorized that personality traits and human behaviors are based on four separate temperaments associated with four fluids or humors of the body. And this is a bust of Hippocrates. The choleric temperament, the yellow bile from your liver, the melancholic temperament, black bile from your kidneys, sanguine temperament, red blood from the heart, phlegmatic temperament, white phlegm from the lungs. There you go, phlegm. Centuries later, the influential Greek physician and philosopher Galen built on Hippocrates' theory, suggesting that both diseases and personality differences could be explained by imbalances in the humors and that each person exhibits one of the four temperaments. The choleric person is passionate, ambitious, and bold. The melancholic person is reserved, anxious, and unhappy. The sanguine person is joyful, eager, and optimistic. And the phlegmatic person is calm, reliable, and thoughtful. Galen's theory was prevalent for over 1,000 years and continued to be popular through the Middle Ages. In 1780, Franz Gall, a German physician, proposed that the distances between bumps in the skull reveal a person's personality traits, character, and mental abilities. According to Gall, measuring these distances revealed the sizes of the brain's areas underneath, providing information that could be used to determine whether a person was friendly, prideful, murderous, kind, good with languages, and so on. Initially, phrenology was very popular. However, it was soon discredited for lack of empirical support and has long been relegated to the status of pseudoscience. And this is a phrenology chart. Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic perspective of personality was the first comprehensive theory of personality, explaining a wide variety of both normal and abnormal behaviors. According to Freud, unconscious drives influenced by sex and aggression, along with childhood sexuality, are the forces that influence our personality. Freud attracted many followers who modified his ideas to create new theories about personality. These theorists, referred to as Neo-Freudians, generally agreed that with Freud that childhood experiences matter, but they reduced the emphasis on sex and focused more on the social environment and effects of culture on personality. The perspective of personality proposed by Freud and his followers was the dominant theory of personality for the first half of the 20th century. Now, the thing we need to remember about Freud is that Freud was writing all of his treatises in the end of the 19th century. The end of the 19th century was very sexually repressed. And since it was sexually repressed, and he was only dealing with adults, one of the things that he noticed was that sex was very important to the adults, and mainly the fact that they were so sexually repressed. And because of that, that's one of the reasons, because they were so sexually repressed, he found that sex was very important to the personality of the individual that they were dealing with. Now, all of this makes a lot of sense if we look at the time that Freud was coming up with his theories. So discounting Freud makes sense today because we're not nearly as sexually repressed. But as far as Freud was concerned, that was the basic problem that he was dealing with. Now, other individuals didn't grow up in a as sexually repressed time frame as he did, even though they were writing and discussing with Freud in Freud's time. And it's mainly because Freud was from a specific place in a specific time. He was from Austria, and Austria at the time was considered the Holy Roman Empire, and of course there was sexual repression, and at the same time there was a lot of sex being taking place. He did most of his theories, most of his writing was in Vienna. And in Vienna, of course, if you were a married woman, then you had to repress your sexuality. If you were not a married woman, if you're a prostitute, for example, you could express your sexuality all you wanted. And this is kind of the basis of what he was talking about. Now, potentially, Freud was also sexually repressed. He grew up in a very strange family. His father married his mother. His mother was 16 when she married her husband, and her husband was in his 50s. He had already raised one family, and so the 16-year-old became his wife and had six more children. So there wasn't a whole lot of interaction going on between Freud's mother and Freud's father. There wasn't a whole lot of intimacy going on. Besides that, they were Jewish, and in the Jewish family, there are dictates as to how affectionate a father can be to his wife and to his children. And because of this, of course, Freud became an individual that she looked to for affection. He was the oldest child in the family, in her family, as weird as all that sounds. So he grew up looking for and gaining his mother's affection, even though it certainly didn't have anything to do with sex. And later on in life, of course, he discovered that that's what he was looking for. He was seeking the attention of women um, who were like his mother, and of course that has a lot to do with all of his theories that came later on. That and the fact that he was dealing with women who were sexually repressed, because this was the mental illness of the time, was the fact that they were all sexually repressed. Freud was the first to systematically study and theorize the workings of the unconscious mind in the manner that we associate with modern psychology. Freud observed individuals, most often women, who reported psychosomatic problems that had no physical basis. These problems were termed hysteria. Freud concluded that hysteria was a result of sexual abuse in childhood and that these traumatic experiences had been hidden from their consciousness. They were repressing these ideas. And one of the reasons that they came to see Freud was because Freud was such an attractive man. To explain the concept of conscious versus unconscious experience, Freud compared the mind to an iceberg. He said that only about 1/10 of one's mind is conscious and the rest of the mind is unconscious. Our unconscious refers to the mental activity of which we are unaware and are unable to access. According to Freud, unacceptable urges and desires are kept in our unconscious through a process called repression. We sometimes say things that we don't intend to say by unintentionally substituting another word for the one that we meant, and this is known as a Freudian slip. Freud suggested that slips of the tongue are actually sexual or aggressive urges accidentally slipping out of our unconscious. Speech errors such as this are quite common. Seeing them as a reflection of unconscious desires, linguists today have found that slips of the tongue tend to occur when we are tired, nervous, or not at our optimal level of cognitive functioning. I'm sorry, Mr. President, I meant bird flu strategy, not bird brain strategy. According to Freud, our personality develops from a conflict between two forces, our biological aggressive and pleasure-seeking drives versus our internal socialized control over these drives. Our personality is a result of our efforts to balance these two competing forces. Freud suggested that we can understand this by imagining three interacting systems within our minds. He called them the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id is our instincts, and that's pleasure-seeking. Our ego is reality, and our superego is morality. In other words, the id is pleasure-seeking, the ego is reality-seeking, and the superego keeps us in line through its morality. Which one is going to win? Is it our pleasure-seeking? Is it our reality-seeking? Or is it our moral-seeking? The unconscious id contains our most primitive drives or urges and is present from birth. It directs impulses for hunger, thirst, and sex. Freud believed that the id operates on what he called the pleasure principle, in which the id seeks immediate gratification. Through social interactions with parents and others in a child's environment, the ego and the superego develop to help control the id. The superego develops as a child interacts with others, learning the social rules for right and wrong. The superego acts as our conscience. It is our moral compass that tells us how we should behave. It strives for perfection and judges our behavior, leading to feelings of pride or, when we fall short of the ideal, feelings of guilt. In contrast to the instinctual id and the rule-based superego, the ego is the rational part of our personality. It's what Freud considered to be the self, and it is the part of our personality that is seen by others. Its job is to balance the demands of the id and the superego in the context of reality. Thus, it operates on what Freud called the reality principle. The ego helps the id satisfy its desires in a realistic way. The id and the superego are in constant conflict because the id wants instant gratification regardless of the consequences, but the superego tells us that we must behave in socially acceptable ways. Thus, the ego's job is to find the middle ground. It helps satisfy the id's desires in a rational way that will not lead us to feelings of guilt. According to Freud, a person who has a strong ego which can balance the demands of the id and the superego has a healthy personality. Freud maintained that imbalances in the system can lead to neurosis, a tendency to experience negative emotions, anxiety disorders, or unhealthy behaviors. A person who is dominated by their id might be narcissistic and impulsive. A person with a dominant superego might be controlled by feelings of guilt and deny themselves even socially acceptable pleasures. Conversely, if the superego is weak or absent, a person might become a psychopath. An overly dominant superego might be seen in an over-controlled individual whose rational grasp on reality is so strong that they are unaware of their emotional needs, or in a neurotic who is overly defensive, overusing their ego defense mechanisms. Freud believed that the feelings of anxiety result from the ego's inability to mediate the conflict between the id and the superego. When this happens, Freud believed that the ego seeks to restore balance through various protective measures known as defense mechanisms. When certain events, feelings, or yearnings cause an individual anxiety, the individual wishes to reduce that anxiety. To do that, the individual's unconscious mind uses ego defense mechanisms, unconscious protective behaviors that aim to reduce anxiety. The ego, usually unconscious, resorts to unconscious strivings to protect the ego from being overwhelmed by anxiety. When we use defense mechanisms, we are unaware that we are using them. Further, they operate in various ways that distort reality. According to Freud, we all use ego defense mechanisms. Sorry, I needed a drink. While everyone uses defense mechanisms, Freud believed that overuse of them may be problematic. Let's say Joe is a high school football player. Deep down, Joe feels sexually attracted to males. His conscious belief is that being gay is immoral, and that if he were gay, his family would disown him and he would be ostracized by his peers. Therefore, there is a conflict between his conscious beliefs, being gay is wrong and will result in being ostracized, and his unconscious urges, attraction to males. The idea that he might be gay causes Joe to have feelings of anxiety. How can he decrease his anxiety? Joe may find himself acting very macho, making gay jokes, and picking on a school peer who is gay. This way, Joe's unconscious impulses are further submerged. There are several different types of defense mechanisms. In repression, anxiety-causing memories from consciousness are blocked. As an analogy, let's say your car is making a strange noise, but because you do not have the money to get it fixed, you just turn up the radio so that you no longer hear the strange sound. Eventually, you forget about it. Similarly, in the human psyche, if a memory is too overwhelming to deal with it, it might be repressed and thus removed from conscious awareness. This repressed memory might cause symptoms in other areas. Denial is where the individual refuses to accept real events because they are too unpleasant to acknowledge. Paul refuses to acknowledge that he has an alcohol problem despite the fact that he gets drunk every single day. He's hiding his head in the sand. Displacement is where an individual transfers inappropriate urges or behavior onto a more acceptable or less threatening target. Susan is mad at her husband, but instead of yelling at him at the restaurant, she verbally abuses the server instead. Projection is when an individual attributes unacceptable desires in them to others. When my first wife started having an affair, she also started accusing me of having an affair. It was very confusing for me, but it was projection on her part. Rationalization is when an individual justifies behaviors by substituting acceptable reasons for less acceptable real reasons. Carla didn't pass her class because she kept skipping and missed taking all her tests, but she told all of her friends that she didn't pass because the professor didn't like her. Professors don't like anybody, so it's not much of an excuse. Reaction formation is when an individual adopts beliefs contrary to their own beliefs in or to reduce anxiety. My mother in law told my wife after she met me that I was a gold digger and would leave her at the drop of a hat, but to my face, she was as sweet as sugar. True story. That's a true story. That's a true story. How many more do I have? That's it. Okay. Regression is when an individual uses a coping strategy for a less mature stage of development to cope with a stressor. When Sylvie was attracted to the men in the bar when her husband was deployed, she began acting and talking like she did when she was a junior high cheerleader before she became sexually active. And that's a true story as well. Sublimation is when an individual redirects their unacceptable desires through a socially acceptable channel. Middle-aged Merle finds the teenage girls in his neighborhood attractive, but instead of flirting with them, he has become more religious and only preaches at them when he is around them. Freud believed that personality develops during early childhood. Childhood experiences shape our personalities as well as our behavior as adults. He asserted that we develop a series of stages during childhood. Each of us must pass through these childhood stages, and if we do not have the proper nurturing and parenting during a stage, we will be stuck or fixated in that stage, even as adults. In each psychosexual stage of development, the child's pleasure-seeking urges coming from the id are focused on a different area of the body called an erogenous zone. The stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. It seems to me like we've been through this before, but let's do it again. During the time when Freud was developing his theories, a climate of sexual repression combined with limited understanding and education surrounding human sexuality heavily influenced Freud's perspective. Given that sex was a taboo topic, Freud assumed that negative emotional states, neuroses, stemmed from suppression of unconscious sexual and aggressive urges. For Freud, his own recollections and interpretations of patients' experiences and dreams were sufficient proof that psychosexual stages were universal events in early childhood. In the oral stage, birth to 1 year, pleasure is focused on the mouth. Eating and the pleasure derived from sucking, nipples, pacifiers, and thumbs play a large part in a baby's first year of life. At around 1 year of age, babies are weaned from the bottle or breast, and this process can create conflict if not handled properly by caregivers. According to Freud, an adult who smokes, drinks, overeats, or bites her nails is fixated in the oral stage of her psychosexual development. They have been weaned too early or too late, resulting in these fixation tendencies, all of which seek to ease anxiety. After passing through the oral stage, children enter what Freud termed the anal stage, 1 to 3 years. In this stage, children experience pleasure in their bowel and bladder movements, so it makes sense that the conflict in this stage is over toilet training. During this stage of development, children work to master control of themselves. Freud suggested that success at the anal stage depended on how parents handled toilet training. Parents who offer praise and rewards encourage positive results and can help children feel competent. Parents who are harsh in toilet training can cause a child to become so fearful of soiling that they over-control and become fixated at the anal stage, leading to the development of an anal retentive personality. The anal retentive personality is stingy and stubborn, has a compulsive need for order and neatness, and might be considered a perfectionist. If parents are too lenient in toilet training, the child may fail to develop sufficient self-control, become fixated at this stage, and develop an anal expulsive personality. The anal expulsive personality is messy, careless, disorganized, and prone to emotional outbursts. Freud's third stage of psychosexual development is the phallic stage, 3 to 6 years, corresponding to the age when children become aware of their bodies and recognize differences between boys and girls. The erogenous zone in this stage is the genitals. Conflict arises when the child feels a desire for the opposite sex parent and jealousy and hatred toward the same sex parent. For boys, this is called the Oedipus complex, involving a boy's desire for his mother and his urge to replace his father, who is seen as a rival for the mother's attention. At the same time, the boy is afraid his father will punish him for his feelings, so he experiences castration anxiety. The Oedipus complex is successfully resolved when the boy begins to identify with his father as an indirect way to have the mother. Failure to resolve the Oedipus complex may result in fixation and development of a personality that might be described as vain and overly ambitious. Now, one of the things that we need to remember is that the parenting style at this time was that the mother took care of the child, and the father didn't have a whole lot to do with the children. The father was authoritarian. He was just more of a figurehead than somebody that interacted with his children on a daily basis. And that was the normal means of interacting with their children. And because of this, because the father's role was so different, that's one of the reasons why you may see you may think of this as totally different from what we see today, and why Freud may have been off base. Of course, he was probably on base for his time, but off base for today's world. Girls experience a comparable conflict in the phallic stage, the Electra complex. The Electra complex, while often attributed to Freud, was actually proposed by Freud's protege, Carl Jung. A girl desires the attention of her father and wishes to take her mother's place. Jung also said that girls are angry with the mother for not providing them with a penis, hence the term penis envy. While Freud initially embraced the Electra complex as a parallel to the Oedipus complex, he later rejected it, yet it remains as a cornerstone of Freudian theory, thanks in part to academics in the field. Following the phallic stage of psychosexual development is a period known as the latency period, 6 years to puberty. This period is not considered a stage because sexual feelings are dormant, as children focus on other pursuits such as school, friendships, hobbies, and sports. Children generally engage in activities with peers of the same sex, which serves to consolidate a child's gender role identity. The final stage is the genital stage, with from puberty on. In this stage, there is a sexual reawakening as the incestuous urges resurface. The young person redirects these urges to other, more socially acceptable partners who often resemble the other sex parent. People in this stage have mature sexual interests, which for Freud meant a strong desire for the opposite sex. Individuals who successfully completed the previous stages, reaching the genital stage with no fixations, are said to be well-balanced and healthy adults. While most of Freud's ideas have not found support in modern research, we cannot discount the contributions that Freud has made to the field of psychology. It was Freud who pointed out that a large part of our mental life is influenced by the experiences of early childhood and takes place outside of our conscious awareness. His theories paved the way for others. While Freud's focus on biological drives led him to emphasize the impact of sociocultural factors on personality development, his followers quickly realized that biology alone could not account for the diversity they encountered as the practice of psychoanalysis spread during the time of the Nazi Holocaust. The anti-Semitism, which was prevalent during this period of time, may have led mainstream psychoanalysts to focus primarily on the universality of the psychological structures of the mind. Freud attracted many followers who modified his ideas to create new theories about the personality. These theorists, referred to as Neo-Freudians, generally agreed with Freud that childhood experiences mattered, but de-emphasized sex, focusing more on social environment, the effects of culture on personality. Four notable Neo-Freudians include Alfred Adler, Erik Erikson, Carl Jung, and Karen Horney. This is Erik Erikson. This is Alfred Adler. This is Karen Horney, of course. And that's a picture of Carl Jung when he was younger. So what we have here, what we're talking about is Freud had the first theory. And so people started to say, no, Freud's wrong. Freud is mostly right, but this is an aspect that he got wrong. So from now on, all the theories that we're going to talk about are theories that people use to try to replace Freud. But there was always an argument as to the fact that Freud was the first one, and they were always arguing with Freud. And that's one of the reasons why Freud's so important. Freud is important because he was first, and people started coming up with new theories that refuted what Freud said. So without Freud, there would be no refutation. There would be no argument. They wouldn't have come up with theories because they wouldn't have needed to. They only needed to come up with new theories to argue with Freud. I hope that makes sense. Without Freud, there is no Jung, there is no Adler, there is no Erikson, there is no Watson. You know, you got to have somebody has to be first, and they have to be the person that everybody said, no, 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 you're wrong. This is how it really is. Alfred Adler, a colleague of Freud's, was the first major theorist to break away from Freud. As a matter of fact, Freud used to have a dinner party every Wednesday night. He called it the Wednesday night group. And it was a bunch of doctors and heavy thinkers in Vienna, and Adler was one of them. Adler and Freud were actually both medical doctors. They were both brain surgeons. And so Adler became part of the group. As a matter of fact, Freud thought of Adler as he was younger than Freud. And Freud thought of him as the person that should take over the group once he retired. But then Adler left the group because he didn't agree with Freud. He was constantly arguing with Freud. And eventually, because no one would listen to him, he decided to leave the group. So he subsequently founded a school of psychology called the individual psychology, which focuses on our drive to compensate for feelings of inferiority. Now, one of the things we're going to notice is that the individuals we're dealing with are people that use their own lives to create their theories. So Freud did. I mean, Freud's idea of the psychosexual thing. I mean, his biggest problem came from the fact that his mother was seeking an intimate partner, and he was as close as she could come. Of course, they never had sex. That wouldn't have happened in that time of place and time. But she was using him as a substitute for her, for the intimacy that she sought from her husband, who had a wife that he was madly in love with. She died, and then he married the 16-year-old girl, and then started having children with her, but he didn't have that strong of feelings for her. So that was Freud's life. So Adler was kind of an interesting person. Adler, he's gonna talk about the inferiority complex, and Adler was, well, as you can see, Adler was not the best looking fellow in the world. But besides that, he also had one leg that was shorter than the other. He had polio when he was younger, and one of his legs was shorter than the other. And for that reason, he felt inferior. He was also not a tall person. Freud was tall and handsome, was a good looking fellow. Where was he? We have him back here somewhere. Where are you, Freud? Freud was a good looking guy. Adler was not. So Adler had an inferiority complex already. And so he based his theories, arguing with Freud, on inferiority. Adler proposed the concept of the inferiority complex. An inferiority complex refers to a person's feelings that they lack worth and don't measure up to the standards of others or of society. Adler's ideas about inferiority represent a major difference between his thinking and Freud's. Freud believed that we are motivated by sexual and aggressive urges, but Adler believed that feelings of inferiority in childhood are what drive people to attempt to gain superiority, and that this striving is the force behind all of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Adler believed in the importance of social connections, seeing childhood developing emerging through social development rather than the sexual stages that Freud outlined. Adler noted the interrelatedness of humanity and the need to work together for the betterment of all. He said the happiness of mankind lies in working together and living as if each individual had set himself the task of contributing to the common welfare, with the main goal of psychology being to recognize the equal rights and equality of others. Rather than focus on sexual or aggressive motives for behavior as Freud did, Adler focused on social motives. Adler identified three fundamental social tasks that all of us must experience: occupational tasks, career; societal tasks, friendship; and love tasks, finding an intimate partner for a long term relationship. He also emphasized conscious rather than unconscious motivation, since he believed that the three fundamental social tasks are explicitly known and pursued. That is not to say that Adler did not also believe in unconscious process. He did, but he felt that conscious processes were more important. One of Adler's major contributions to personality psychology was the idea that our birth order shapes our personality. He proposed that older siblings who start out as the focus of their parents' attention must share that attention once a new child joins the family, compensate by becoming overachievers. The youngest children, according to Adler, may be spoiled, leaving the middle child with the opportunity to minimize the negative dynamics of the youngest and oldest children. And surprise, surprise, Adler was a middle child. Adler was not only a middle child, but when Adler was a young child, his younger brother was born, but his younger brother was born sickly. So what they would do, they would put his younger brother in bed with him so that Adler could keep him warm. And one night, his brother died, and he woke up with his brother beside him, cold and dead. As weird as that may sound. Okay, so and that that really freaked him out, as you can imagine. So birth order was really important as far as he was concerned, mainly because he was a middle child. He had an older brother that was a barn burner, and he had younger siblings besides the one that died. He had other younger siblings that were spoiled. Erik Erikson was not part of the Wednesday night group. He met Freud later on. Erik Erikson met Freud's daughter Anna Freud while he was tutoring in Vienna. Freud was a fascinating person. He was looking for his father. His father was, well, let me get through this and then I'll tell you this story. Eventually, he met Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, and since he had already worked with children and Anna Freud was working with children, Sigmund Freud never worked with children. He only worked with adults, and so he got all of his theoretical information from talking to adults, and they're the ones that told him that childhood was the important time. But Anna Freud actually worked with children. And so when Erik Erikson came to Vienna in the 1930s, he started working with Anna Freud. And because of that, he met Sigmund, and then he came up with his own theory. It was Anna Freud who encouraged Erikson to study psychoanalysis. In 1933, as Nazism spread across Europe, Erikson fled the country and immigrated to the United States. Erikson later proposed a psychosocial theory of development, suggesting that an individual's personality develops throughout the lifespan, a departure from Freud's view that personality is fixed in early life. In his theory, Erikson emphasized the social relationships that are important at each stage of personality development, in contrast to Freud's emphasis on sex. Erikson identified 8 stages, each of which represents a conflict or developmental task. The development of a healthy personality and a sense of competence depends on the successful completion of each task. And here are the 8 stages. Oh, that's it with Erikson. Okay, well, let me tell you about Erikson. Erikson's mother was Jewish. She gave birth to Erik, and actually, that wasn't his original name. His name was not Erik Erikson. Um, he was born in a town that near where I used to live. I'm trying to think what it was. I think it was Holmberg. Anyway, he was born there, and his mother was Jewish, and she had black hair, black, kind of curly hair. And his father was Jewish as well, and he had black hair. But it turned out, after he was born, that the mother admitted to the father that Erik wasn't his. The reason was because Erik was born with blonde hair and blue eyes. Now, Jewish people usually don't have blonde hair and blue eyes. And so, because of that, the first man that was theoretically his father left. And so here she is. She's a single parent with a child that obviously is not Jewish. And eventually she married the pediatrician, Erik's pediatrician. I'm trying to think what his name was. I think his name was Holmberg. Anyway, so he grew up thinking that this guy was his father. And then but he had a problem. His problem was the fact that he looked German, blonde haired and blue eyed, but he was actually Jewish. And because he was Jewish, the Germans rejected him. And because he was blonde haired and blue eyed and looked German, the Jewish people rejected him. And this was kind of a problem. Of course, he was a child of a doctor, so he was acceptable in society, but not acceptable in society. So when he was 16 years old, the year before he graduated from high school, he was an excellent student because nobody would pay any attention to him. He was a good student because he never went anywhere. He always stayed home and studied because nobody would play with him when he was a child, and nobody messed with him when he was a teenager because he looked too German to date Jewish girls, and he was too Jewish for German girls. So when he was 16 years old, his mother admitted to him that she had had an affair with a Danish sea captain. And at that point, he dropped out of school and started traveling around Europe looking for his father. So he traveled all over the place, found his way to Vienna, or not to Vienna, but to Rome, where he studied, or he got a job with the first Montessori school in Rome, Italy, and he learned the Montessori method. And then he started traveling throughout the rest of Europe, found his way to Vienna, and that's when he met Freud's daughter. Okay, so because he had had so many social problems while he was growing up, that he came up with the psychosocial theory. And of course, we're not going to talk about the psychosocial theory, obviously. We talked about that earlier when we talked about childhood development. So that was Erik Erikson. I probably told you that story before, didn't I? Anyway, there's your stages. 8 stages, but his go all the way to death, so that's kind of nice. So now Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and protege of Freud's. The Wednesday night group. He joined the Wednesday night group. He had heard of Freud. He had read Freud's work. So he traveled from his home in Switzerland to Vienna, Virginia. Switzerland is adjacent to Vienna. It wasn't that much of a trip, but Carl was really smart, and he adopted. Uh, he he had a very strict father, and because he had a strict father, when he went to Vienna to talk with Freud, he adopted Freud as his father. Now, the one interesting thing about Jung is that his father was a Swiss Reformed Church minister, and he was very, very strict. So he was raised in a very religious, very Christian home, and of course, Freud was Jewish, and all of the rest of the people were Jewish. So it was really interesting that Jung had different ideas. And it turned out that one of his ideas was that he was superior to the Jewish uh, philosophies, and that came in, became important later on. So let's go ahead. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and protege of Freud's, who later split off from him and developed his own theory, which he called analytical psychology. The focus of analytical psychology is on working to balance opposing forces of conscious and unconscious thought and experience within one's personality. According to Jung, this work is a continuous learning process, mainly occurring in the second half of life, of becoming aware of unconscious elements and integrating them into your consciousness. Jung's split from Freud was based on 2 major disagreements. Actually, it was 3, but let me go through the 2 and then I'll tell you what the third was. First, Jung, like Adler and Erikson, did not accept that sexual drive was the primary motivator in a person's mental life. Second, although Jung agreed with Freud's concept of a personal unconscious, he thought it to be incomplete. In addition to personal unconscious, Jung focused on the collective unconscious. Now, there was a third reason that he split with Freud, and the third reason had to do with this lady, Karen Horney. Karen Horney was part of the Wednesday night group. She was Jewish. She was a psychoanalyst. She was a psychologist. She worked with women, and she was very attractive. You can't really see it from this picture. But she was young and she was very attractive, and of course she was the only female in the group, and because of that, Freud told everybody to leave her alone. He didn't want anybody to seduce her. But what happened? And of course, Jung felt that he was superior to everybody else because he was Christian. So he did. He seduced her. And Freud got mad. and that was really the reason why Jung left the group. Later on, Jung worked with the Nazis and came up with explanations of things, but according to some reports, he was actually working for the Allies and explaining the psychological manifestations of the Nazi hierarchy. But he worked with the Nazis anyway. So that's Jung. The collective unconscious is a universal version of the personal unconscious, holding mental patterns or memory traces which are common to all of us. These ancestral memories, which Jung called archetypes, are represented by universal themes in various cultures as expressed through literature, art, and dreams. Jung said that these themes reflect common experiences of people in the world over, such as facing death, becoming independent, and striving for mastery. Jung believed, and here are the archetypes: the innocent, the orphan, the hero, the caregiver, the explorer, the rebel, the lover, the creator, the jester, the sage, the magician, and the ruler. And these are all his archetypes. Jung believed that through biology, each person is handed down the same themes and at the same types of symbols, such as the hero, the maiden, the sage, the trickster. They all represent in the folklore and fairy tales of every culture. In Jung's view, the task of integrating these unconscious archetypal aspects of the self is part of the self-realization process in the second half of life. With this orientation toward self-realization, Jung parted ways with Freud's belief that personality is determined solely by past events and anticipated the humanistic movement with its emphasis on self-actualization and orientation toward the future. Jung also proposed two attitudes or approaches toward life: extroversion and introversion. These ideas are considered Jung's most important contributions to the field of personality psychology, as almost all models of personality now include these concepts. If you're an extrovert, you are a person who is energized by being outgoing and socially oriented. You derive your energy from being around others. If you're an introvert, then you are a person who may be quiet and reserved, or you may be social, but your energy is derived from your inner psychic activity. Jung believed a balance between extroversion and introversion best served the goal of self-realization. Okay, and this has to do with when we were quarantined during COVID. The extrovert wanted to get out, and the introvert was perfectly happy by himself, dealing with things. And actually, this is me. This is me. When I was able to to come back to Iowa. I live in the middle of a cornfield, so this isn't me. This was certainly not me. And that's one of the reasons I never came back to say Lee, because it's a lot easier for me to be in the middle of a cornfield than it is to live in a hogan in the middle of the faculty hogan area. Another concept proposed by Jung was the persona, which he referred to as a mask that we adopt. According to Jung, we consciously create this persona. However, it is derived from both our conscious experiences and our collective unconscious. Jung believed that the persona is a compromise between who we really are, our true self, and what society expects us to be. We hide those parts of ourselves that are not aligned with society's expectations. And this is really kind of interesting because if you and I don't look at the Oscars. I don't really care. I don't care about the movies. I don't care about the the individuals, but when you see people on the red carpet, fascinating. It's just fascinating to look at their faces and to see the way that they interact with the press and with taking pictures. A lot of times, when somebody wants to take their picture, they smile, and it's a fake smile, of course, but they only smile in the way that makes them look the most attractive. It's not a real smile. They're not smiling with their eyes. They're only smiling with their mouths. But this whole red carpet thing, it was just, it was last night. Actually, the Oscars were last night, and there were these two people talking about the outfits that people were wearing, and some of them were retro. This is retro 1970s. This is retro 1980s. They were, some of them covered and some of them weren't nearly as covered. It's just fascinating listening to them talking about all this superficiality, all these, this is the Dior dress, that kind of stuff. Just fascinating. Anyway, that's when we're talking about the persona, that's what we're talking about. And of course, you read about actors and actresses, and this is who they are on the screen, and this is who they are on TMZ, and this is who they really are, because they don't want to be that. This is the person that their publicist has told them they have to act like. But then, of course, eventually we discover who they really are. And then they wander off to a ranch in Montana or Idaho or whatever, and where they can be their own selves. Fascinating stuff. Anyway, there you go, Carl Jung. Karen Horney was one of the first women trained as a Freudian psychoanalyst. During the Great Depression, Horney moved from Germany to the United States and subsequently moved away from Freud's teachings. Like Jung, Horney believed that each individual has the potential for self-realization and that the goal of psychoanalysis should be moved toward a healthy self rather than exploring early childhood patterns of dysfunction. Horney also disagreed with the Freudian idea that girls have penis envy and are jealous of male biological features. According to Horney, any jealousy is most likely culturally based due to the greater privileges that males often have, meaning that the differences between men's and women's personalities are culturally based, not biologically based. She further suggested that men have womb envy because they cannot give birth. Horney's theories focused on the role of unconscious anxiety. She suggested that normal growth can be blocked by basic anxiety stemming from needs not being met, such as childhood experiences of loneliness and or isolation. Horney suggested three styles of coping. The first coping style, moving toward people, relies on affiliation and dependence. These children become dependent on their parents and their caregivers in an effort to receive attention and affection, which provides relief from anxiety. When these children grow up, they tend to use this same coping strategy to deal with relationships expressing an intense need for love and acceptance. The second coping style, moving against people, relies on aggression and assertiveness. Children with this coping style find that fighting is the best way to deal with an unhappy home situation, and they deal with their feelings of insecurity by bullying other children. As adults, people with this coping style tend to lash out with hurtful comments and exploit others. The third coping style, moving away from people, centers on detachment and isolation. These children handle their anxiety by withdrawing from the world. They need privacy and tend to be self-sufficient. When these children are adults, they continue to avoid such things as love and friendship, and they also tend to gravitate toward careers that require little interaction with others. Behaviors do not, okay, so we're talking about all of these individuals that lived up until World War II. They were very important until World War II. Jung, Horney, Adler. Adler was actually a doctor during World War I, a surgeon during World War One. Freud didn't have to go, but he sent his two sons went to war. They were Austrian. They fought in Italy. So when we're talking about all these individuals, you might think, well, wait a minute, this doesn't fit today's society, that doesn't fit today's society. And the reality is society changes, times change. Of course, you got this guy's on his phone looking at something. Everything changes. And for that reason, yeah, this stuff made a whole lot of sense back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe into the 90s, but now we need to come up with our own ideas. It's the same thing with behaviorism. We're going to talk about behaviorist perspective right now, but the behaviorist perspective was very important in the leading up to World War II. It's an American perspective. All the other perspectives, all the other personality perspectives we've been talking about were continental, they were European. And for that reason, we need to take what fits and reject what doesn't fit. Now, some of the ideas from the Europeans is fairly accurate. Some of it's not. Some of it just doesn't fit our society. Our society is not nearly as crowded as theirs is. And you've got to remember that when we're talking about these people, we're talking about people that lived in cities. Not only did they live in cities, but they lived in overcrowded cities and they didn't want to go out into the country. In the United States, we're the opposite. We live in the country, and most of us don't want to live in cities. So that's one of the things that we need to think about. The other thing is that you guys are Navajo and you have your own way of thinking of things. You have your own culture, and your own culture needs to have their own understanding of the mind. And for that reason, you need to come up with your own idea of personality. Now, a lot of individuals are going to say, wait a minute, you don't have the right to come up with your own theory of personality. You've got to accept these great minds, Freud and Adler and Jung and Horney and Erickson. You've got to accept their concept of personality. But I'm going to give you I'm going to tell you that you have the strength and the power to come up with your own theories of personality. We're going to talk about behaviorist perspective because it's an American perspective. But you need to take from this anything that fits and reject anything that doesn't fit. Behaviorists do not believe in biological determinism. They do not see personality traits as inborn. Instead, they view personality as significantly shaped by reinforcements and consequences outside of the organism. In other words, people behave in a consistent manner based on prior learning. B.F. Skinner, a strict behaviorist, believed that environment was solely responsible for all behavior, including the enduring consistent behavior patterns studied by personality theorists. Now, why in the world would Americans not care about anything that's inborn? Well, one reason is because they wanted to shape people's way of thinking. Why? Because they need those people to work in their factories and make them money. So they need to support the idea that they can control people's behavior. Skinner proposed that we demonstrate consistent behavior patterns because we have developed certain response tendencies. We learn to behave in particular ways. We increase the behaviors that lead to positive consequences, and we decrease the behaviors that lead to negative consequences. Skinner disagreed with Freud's idea that personality is fixed in childhood. He argued that personality develops over our entire life, not only in the first few years. Bandura proposed the concept of reciprocal determinism, in which cognitive processes, behavior, and context all interact, each factor influencing and being influenced by the others simultaneously. Cognitive processes refer to all the characteristics previously learned, including beliefs, expectations, and personality characteristics. Behavior refers to anything that we do that may be rewarded or punished. Finally, the context in which the behavior occurs refers to the environment or situation, which includes rewarding, punishing stimuli. How many pictures are there? Bandura's key contribution to learning theory was the idea that much learning is vicarious. We learn by observing someone else's behavior and its consequences, which Bandura called observational learning. He felt that this type of learning also plays a part in the development of our personality. Just as we learn individual behaviors, we learn new behavior patterns when we see them performed by other people or models. Drawing on the behaviorist idea about reinforcement, Bandura suggested that whether we choose to imitate a model's behavior depends on whether we see the model reinforced or punished. Through observational learning, we come to learn that behaviors are acceptable and rewarded in our culture, and we also learn to inhibit deviant or socially unacceptable behaviors by seeing what behaviors are punished. Bandura has studied a number of cognitive and personal factors that affect learning and personality development, and most recently has focused on the concept of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is our level of confidence in our own abilities developed through our social experiences. Self-efficacy affects how we approach challenges and reach goals. In observational learning, self-efficacy is a cognitive factor that affects which behaviors we choose to imitate, as well as our success in performing those behaviors. Julian Rotter in 1966 proposed the concept of locus of control, another cognitive factor that affects learning and personality development. Distinct from self-efficacy, which involves our belief in our own abilities, locus of control refers to our beliefs about the power we have over our own lives. In Rotter's view, people possess either an internal or an external locus of control. Those with an internal locus of control, internals, tend to believe that most of their outcomes are the direct result of their efforts. Those with an external locus of control, the externals, tend to believe that their outcomes are outside of their control. Externals see their lives as being controlled by other people, luck, or chance. Walter Mischel worked with delayed gratification and personality. Mischel determined that when willingness to delay gratification becomes part of the individual's personality, the individual is able to become a more successful student, had higher SAT scores, had positive peer relationships, were less likely to have substance abuse issues. As adults, they also had more stable marriages. Later, researchers determined that delayed gratification was situational and not an absolute personality trait. As the third force in psychology, humanism is touted as a reaction. The other two, first two forces in psychology are behaviorism and Freudianism or psychoanalysis. So the third force in psychology is humanism. It's touted as a reaction both to the pessimistic determinism of psychoanalysis, with its emphasis on psychological disturbance, and to the behaviorist view of humans passively reacting to the environment, which has been criticized as making people out to be personalityless robots. It does not suggest that psychoanalytic behaviorists and other points of view are incorrect, but argues that these perspectives do not recognize the depth and the meaning of human experience and fail to recognize the innate capacity for self-directed change and transforming personal experiences. The humanist perspective focuses on how healthy people develop. One pioneering humanist, Abraham Maslow, studied people who he considered to be healthy, creative, and productive, including Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and others. Maslow found that such people share similar characteristics, such as being open, creative, loving, spontaneous, compassionate, concerned for others, and accepting of themselves. Humanist Carl Rogers' main ideas about personality regards self-concept, our thoughts and feelings about ourselves. Rogers further divided the self into two categories, the ideal self and the real self. The ideal self is the person that you would like to be, and the real self is the person you actually are. Rogers focused on the idea that we need to achieve consistency between these two selves. We experience congruence when our thoughts about our real self and ideal self are very similar. In other words, when our self-concept is accurate, high congruence leads to a higher sense of self-worth and a healthy, productive life. Parents can help their children achieve this by giving them unconditional positive regard or unconditional love. According to Rogers, as persons are accepted and prized, they tend to develop a more caring attitude towards themselves. Conversely, when there is a great discrepancy between our ideal and actual selves, we experience a state Rogers called incongruence, which can lead to maladjustment. And of course, I was trained as a Rogerian. The Minnesota Twin Studies The Minnesota Study of Twins Reared Apart conducted research with twins from 1979 to 1999. In studying 350 pairs of twins, including pairs of identical and fraternal twins reared together and apart, researchers found that identical twins, whether raised together or apart, have very similar personalities. These findings suggest the heritability of some personality traits, and these are two individuals that were raised apart. As you can see, they look very similar because they're identical twins, but they both grew mustaches and they both became firemen, even though they didn't know of each other. And there you go. These are triplets that were the identical triplets that were raised apart. And they found each other. Strangely, they found each other and they realized that they all had the same personality. Heritability refers to the proportion of difference among people that is attributed to genetics. Some of the traits that the study reported as having more than a 0.50 heritability ratio, including leadership, obedience to authority, a sense of well-being, alienation, resistance to stress, and fearfulness. The implication is that some aspects of our personalities are largely controlled by genetics. However, it's important to point out that traits are not determined by a single gene, but by a combination of many genes, as well as by epigenetic factors that control whether the genes are expressed or not. Most contemporary psychologists believe temperament has a biological basis due to its appearance very early in our lives. Thomas and Chess found that babies could be categorized into one of three temperaments: easy, difficult, or slow to warm up. However, environmental factors, family interactions, for example, and maturation can affect the ways in which children's personalities are expressed. Research suggests that there are two dimensions of our temperament that are important parts of our adult personality: reactivity and self-regulation. Reactivity refers to how we respond to new or challenging environmental stimuli. Self-regulation refers to our ability to control that response. Trait theorists believe personality can be understood via the approach that all people have certain traits or characteristic ways of behaving. Trait theorist Gordon Allport found 4,500 words in English that could describe people. He organized these personality traits into three categories: cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. A cardinal trait is one that dominates your entire personality and hence your life. Cardinal traits are not very common. Few people have personalities dominated by a single trait. Instead, our personalities typically are composed of multiple traits. Central traits are those that make up our personality, such as loyal, kind, agreeable, friendly, sneaky, wild, and grouchy. Second traits are those that are not quite as obvious or as consistent as central traits. They are present under specific circumstances and include preferences and attitudes. In an effort to make the list of traits more manageable, Raymond Cattell narrowed down to 16 factors or dimensions of personality: warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rural consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self reliance, perfectionism, and tension are the 16. He developed a personality assessment based on these 16 factors called the 16 PF, or 16 personality factors. Instead of a trait being present or absent, each dimension is scored over a continuum from high to low. And there you go. There are the 16. Psychologists Hans and Sybil Eysenck were personality theorists who focused on temperament, the inborn genetically based personality. They believed personality is largely governed by biology. The Eysencks viewed people as having two specific personality dimensions: extroversion and introversion, and neuroticism and stability. That's an interesting picture. This is Hans, and this is Sybil. That's their cat, who seems to be more important than their kid. Interesting picture. According to the Eysencks theory, people high on the trait of extroversion are sociable and outgoing and readily connect with others, whereas people high on the trait of introversion have a higher need to be alone, engage in solitary behaviors, and limit their interactions with others. In the neuroticism stability dimension, people high in neuroticism tend to be anxious. They tend to have an overactive sympathetic nervous system, and even with low stress, their bodies and emotional states tend to go into fight or flight reaction. People high on stability tend to need more stimulation to activate their fight or flight reaction and are considered more emotionally stable. Later, the Eysencks added a third dimension, psychoticism versus superego control. In this dimension, people who are high on psychoticism tend to be independent thinkers, cold nonconformists, impulsive, antisocial, and hostile, whereas people who are high on superego control tend to have high impulse control. They're more altruistic, empathetic, cooperative, and conventional. Another personality theory is the five-factor model, with its 5 factors referred to as the Big Five personality factors. It is the most popular theory in personality psychology today and the most accurate approximation of the basic personality dimensions. The 5 factors are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The 5-factor model, each person has each factor, but they occur along a spectrum. Openness to experience is characterized by imagination, feelings, actions, and ideas. People who score high on this factor tend to be curious and have a wide range of interests. Conscientiousness is characterized by competence, self-discipline, thoughtfulness, and achievement striving or goal-directed behavior. People who score high on this factor are hardworking and dependable. Numerous studies have found a positive correlation between conscientiousness and academic success. Extroversion is characterized by sociability, assertiveness, excitement seeking, and emotional expression. People who score high on this factor are usually described as outgoing and warm. Not surprisingly, people who score high on both extroversion and openness are more likely to participate in adventure and risky sports due to their curious and excitement seeking nature. The fourth factor is agreeableness, which is the tendency to be pleasant, cooperative, trustworthy, and good natured. People who score low on agreeableness tend to be described as rude and uncooperative, yet one recent study reported that men who scored low on this factor actually earned more money than men who were considered more agreeable. Neuroticism is a tendency to experience negative emotions. People high on neuroticism tend to experience emotional instability and are characterized as angry, impulsive, and hostile. Clark and Watson found that people reporting high levels of neuroticism also tend to report feelings anxious and unhappy. People who score low in neuroticism tend to be calm and even tempered. The big five personality factors each represent a range between two extremes. Most of us tend to lie somewhere midway along the continuum of each factor rather than at polar ends. It's important to note that the big five factors are relatively stable over our lifespan, with some tendency for the factors to increase or decrease slightly. Researchers have found that conscientiousness increases through young adulthood into middle age as we become better able to manage our personal relationships and careers. Agreeableness also decreases with age, peaking between 50 to 70 years. Neuroticism and extroversion tend to decline slightly with age. The big five factors have been shown to exist across ethnicities, cultures, and ages, and may have substantial biological and genetic components. Okay, let's talk about the five-factor model. The five-factor model was developed by two researchers at the RAND Corporation for the Air Force. The Air Force was part of the Army during World War II, and then in 1948 it became a separate branch of the service. And Air Force officers have to be different, were different from Army officers. So for that reason, they tasked the RAND Corporation to come up with a personality test that they could give to officer candidates to find out if they could fly airplanes and not crash them. So they came up with a five-factor model, and and then they wrote a paper about it, and they used it in the Air Force to determine, these are guys that they're in essence in the 1950s they were in combat in Korea. They were also testing airplanes that flew very, very fast, and they needed fast reaction times. What personality becomes the best pilot? That was what they needed to come up with. So then, about 10 years later, somebody found this paper and decided that they would print it. So there's there's the people that established the theory from the RAND Corporation for the Air Force that the Air Force had been using for a dozen years. And then there are the individuals that found it and said, hey, this really fits with the general population. And that's where the five-factor model comes out. It comes in. It really does fit. They used the 16 personality factors from Cattell to come up with their five-factor model, and this is how they determined who could become a Air Force pilot or an Air Force officer, actually. So it's a military thing. Personality is shaped by both genetic and environmental factors. The culture in which you live is one of the most important environmental factors that shapes your personality. The term culture refers to all of the beliefs, customs, art, and traditions of a particular society. Culture is transmitted to people through language as well as through the modeling of culturally acceptable and non-acceptable behaviors that are either rewarded or punished. Personality psychologists have become interested in the role of culture in understanding personality. It appears that there are both universal and culture specific aspects that account for variation in people's personalities. Western ideas about personality may not be acceptable to other cultures. The strength of personality traits varies across cultures. Asian cultures are more collectivist, and people in these cultures tend to be less extroverted, skewing the big five. People in Central and South American cultures tend to score higher on the big five in openness to experience, whereas Europeans score higher on neuroticism. There seem to be regional personality differences within the United States. Researchers analyzed responses from over 1.5 million individuals in the United States and found that there are three distinct regional personality clusters. Cluster 1 is in the upper Midwest and deep South and is dominated by people who fall into the friendly and conventional personality. Cluster 2 includes the West and is dominated by people who are more relaxed, emotionally stable, calm, and creative. Cluster 3 in the Northeast has more people who are stressed, irritable, and depressed. People who live in Cluster 2 and 3 are also generally more open. Okay, so you're open here, you're open here, we're closed here. This is where I live. This is where I'm from. I've lived here and here and here and here. Where else have I lived? I've lived here. And of course up in Montana. Anyway. One explanation for the regional differences is selective migration. Selective migration is a concept that people choose to move to places that are compatible with their personalities and needs. Renfro and colleagues in 2009 noted an overlap between geographical regions and personality characteristics that goes beyond the often used explanations of religion, racial diversity, and education. Their research suggests that psychological profile of region is closely related to that of its residents. They found that levels of openness and conscientiousness in a state may predict voting patterns, indicating that there are correlations between geographic regions and personality differences between liberals and conservatives, relating to political views, levels of economic vitality, and entrepreneurial rates. Okay, this is where I'm from, and this is where I live right now. I live right there. I'm from right there. Okay, so why in the world did I choose to live in Iowa, and enjoyed living in Montana? I also enjoyed living in Oklahoma. I didn't like living in Texas, but I didn't mind living in Mississippi. I was real nervous. I didn't really like living in Maryland or in California, and wasn't that happy in Arizona. No offense. And maybe it's because this is where I'm from. I grew up on a farm in Indiana, and now I live on a farm in an apple orchard in Iowa. So you can take all that to the bank if you like. Individuals' cultures and collectivist cultures place emphasis on different basic values. People who live in individualist cultures tend to believe that independence, competition, and personal achievement are important. Individuals in Western nations such as the United States, England, and Australia score high on individualism. People who live in collectivist cultures value social harmony, respectfulness, and group needs over individual needs. Individuals who live in countries in Asia, Africa, and South America score high on collectivism. These values influence personality. Dana in 1986 suggested that personality assessment services for Native Americans are often provided without a proper recognition of culture-specific responses and a tribe-specific frame of reference. Assessors need to have more than a general knowledge of history, tribal differences, contemporary culture on reservations, and levels of acculturation in order to interpret psychological test responses with a minimal bias. This is really kind of interesting because when I was in Montana, Northern Plains, responses were different than they are in the Southwest. So I would warn you that if you're going to leave the reservation and go to another reservation to work, that you recognize that that culture may be completely different than yours. Just because you're both indigenous peoples doesn't mean that they're going to have the same response that you're used to wherever you're going. Because I can tell you that the Northern Plains isn't the same as the Southwest. There are three approaches that can be used to study personality in a cultural context: the cultural comparative approach, the indigenous approach, the combined approach, which incorporates elements of both views. Since ideas about personality have a Western basis, the cultural comparative approach seeks to test Western ideas about personality in other cultures to determine whether they can be generalized and if they have cultural validity. The other thing you need to remember about different indigenous groups is that they all have different cultures, and they are all assimilated at a lesser or greater level of Western acceptance. And that's something that you need to acknowledge. Researchers used a cultural comparative approach to test the universality of five-factor model. They found applicability in numerous cultures around the world, with the big five factors being stable in many cultures. The indigenous approach came about in reaction to the dominance of Western approaches to the study of personality in non-Western settings. Because Western-based personality assessments cannot fully capture the personality constructs of other cultures, the indigenous model has led to the development of personality assessment instruments that are based on constructs relevant to the culture being studied. The third approach to cross-cultural studies of personality is the combined approach, which serves as a bridge between Western and indigenous psychology as a way of understanding both universal and cultural variations in personality. Self-report inventories are a kind of objective test used to assess personality. They typically use multiple choice items or numbered scales, which represent a range from 1 strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree. Self-report inventories are generally easy to administer and cost-effective. There is an increased likelihood of test takers being inclined to answer in ways that are intentionally or unintentionally more socially desirable, exaggerated, biased, or misleading. One of the most widely used personality inventories is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, first published in 1943 with 504 true-false questions and updated to the MMPI-2 in 1989 with 567 questions. The original MMPI was based on a small limited sample composed mostly of Minnesota farmers and psychiatric patients. The revised inventory was based on a more representative national sample to allow for better standardization, including indigenous peoples from Minnesota. Okay, so I started in psychology in 1976. So I learned to use the MMPI-1, the MMPI, and the MMPI-2 didn't come about until 1989. By that time, I started teaching college courses in 1991. So the MMPI-2 was out there, but we were mostly quoting the MMPI. The MMPI-2 takes 1 to 2 hours to complete. You can imagine 567 questions. Yep. Responses are scored to produce a clinical profile composed of 10 scales: hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviance, social deviance, masculinity versus femininity, paranoia, psychosthenia, obsessive compulsive qualities, schizophrenia, hypomania, and social introversion. There is also a scale to certain risk factors for alcohol abuse. In 2008, the test was again revised using more advanced methods to the MMPI-2 RF revised form. That's what it is. This version takes about one half the time to complete and has only 338 questions. Despite the new test's advantages, the MPI-2 is more established and is still more widely used. Typically, the tests are administered by computer. Although the MMPI was originally developed to assist the clinical diagnosis of psychological disorders, it is now also used for occupational screening, such as in law enforcement and in college, career, and marital counseling. In addition to clinical scales, the tests also have validity and reliability scales. One of the validity scales, the LI scale or L scale, consists of 15 items and is used to ascertain whether the respondent is faking good under reporting psychological problems to appear healthier. Reliability scales test an instrument's consistency over time, assuring that if you take the MMPI-2 RF today and then again 5 years later, your two scores will be similar. Butler and colleagues in 1988 gave the MMPI to newly recruited police officers and then to the same police officers 2 years later. After 2 years on the job, police officers' responses indicated an increased vulnerability to alcoholism, somatic symptoms, vague, unexplained physical complaints, and anxiety. When the test was given an additional 2 years later, 4 years after starting on the job, the results suggested a high risk for alcohol-related difficulties. Another method for assessment of personality is projective testing. This kind of test relies on one of the defense mechanisms proposed by Freud, projection, as a way to assess unconscious processes. During this type of testing, a series of ambiguous cards is shown to the person being tested, who then is encouraged to project his feelings, impulses, and desires onto the cards by telling a story, interpreting an image, or completing a sentence. Many projective tests have undergone standardization procedures and can be used to assess whether someone has unusual thoughts or a high level of anxiety or is likely to become volatile. Some examples of projective tests are the Rorschach inkblot test, the thematic apperception test, this is the thematic apperception test, this picture to the right, the contemporized themes concerning blacks test, the TEMAS, the Tell Me a Story, and the Rotter Incomplete Sentence Blank. Projective tests are less subject to intentional distortion. It is hard to fake good because it is not obvious what a good answer is. Projective tests are more time-consuming for the evaluator than self-report inventories. If an evaluator scores a Rorschach using the Exner scoring scale system, the test is considered a valid and reliable measure. This is a TAT. This is the thematic apperception test. However, the validity of the other projective tests is questionable and the results are often not usable for court cases. The Rorschach inkblot test was developed in 1921 by a Swiss psychologist named Hermann Rorschach. It is a series of symmetrical inkblot cards that are presented to a client by a psychologist. Upon presentation of each card, the psychologist asks the client, "What might this be?" What the test taker sees reveals unconscious feelings and struggles. The Rorschach has been standardized using the Exner system and is effective in measuring depression, psychosis, and anxiety. And that's Rorschach right there on your right. This is an ink blot from the original. It's not used anymore. That's why I can show it. But I think that he looks like Brad Pitt. First time I saw a picture of Rorschach, I thought, he looks just like Brad Pitt. maybe not. The thematic apperception test was created in the 1930s by Henry Murray and Christiana Morgan. A person taking the TAT is shown 8 to 12 ambiguous pictures and is asked to tell a story about each picture. The stories give insight into their social world, revealing hopes, fears, interests, and goals. The storytelling format helps to lower a person's resistance, divulging unconscious personal details. The TAT has been used in clinical settings to evaluate psychological disorders. More recently, has been used in counseling settings to help clients gain a better understanding of themselves and achieve personal growth. Standardization of test administration is virtually non-existent among clinicians, and the test tends to be modest to low on validity and reliability. This is a picture from the TAT. Whoops, I'm sorry, going the wrong direction. That's a picture from the TAT, and that's a picture from the TAT. They change the pictures from time to time. Usually it's the hair that they're changing. What a low bed. Why in the world is she doing laying down there? And of course, she looks like she's dead. Maybe he's dead too. Who knows? Third projective test is the Rotter Incomplete Sentence Blank, developed by Julian Rotter in 1950. There are 3 forms of this test for use with different age groups: the school form, the college form, and the adult form. The tests include 40 incomplete sentences that people are asked to complete as quickly as possible. The average time for completing the test is approximately 20 minutes, as responses are only 1 to 2 words in length. This test is similar to a word association test, and like other types of projective tests, it is presumed that responses will reveal desires, fears, and struggles. The RISB is used in screening college students for adjustment problems and in career counseling, and there they are. The happiest time, my earliest memory of my mother, what annoys me, I want to know, I failed in school, people, I hate men, when I am older, when I was a child, the worst thing a woman can do to a man, a mother, if I were long, if I were king, if I were king, when I see a man and a woman together. Robert Williams developed the first culturally specific projective test designed to reflect the everyday life experiences of African Americans. The updated version of the instrument is the Contemporized Themes Concerning Blacks test. The CTCB contains 20 color images that show scenes of African American lifestyles. When the CTCB was compared with the TAT, for most African Americans, it was found that use of the CTCB led to increased story length, higher degrees of positive feelings, and a stronger identification with the CTCB. The TIMAS Multicultural Thematic Apperception Test is another tool designed to be culturally relevant to minority groups, especially Hispanic youths. TIMAS standing for Tell Me a Story, but also a play on the Spanish word temas, which means themes, uses images and storytelling cues that relate to minority cultures. And that is it. There you go. Okay, that's long enough. We'll tackle chapter 12 next.